Hello, everyone, and welcome back after the short break from the previous part of this session. Um, so it's now my great pleasure to introduce to you all Markus Brunnermeier. Markus is the Edwards S. Sanford Professor in the Economics Department at Princeton University, and he's the director of Princeton's Bendheim Center for Finance. As you will, I'm sure, know, his research focuses on international financial markets and the macroeconomy, with special emphasis on bubbles, liquidity, financial stability, monetary policy, and digital money. And Markus has made major contributions on many issues within these fields, both theoretical, practical, and policy implications as well. And I think it's fair to say that over the past 15 years, Markus has always been at the forefront of the debate. And we're really glad that he's going to give us a lecture on climate change and monetary policy, which I think is an issue that's both topical and in need of greater academic insight. Just in terms of logistics, Markus is happy to take questions throughout his presentation to make it a little bit more interactive. But in order to make this manageable, please could you all write any questions that you might have into the chat box, and at the right opportunity, we can put these to Markus. And we'll also try and leave some time at the end of the session if we have time for further questions. But let me stop there, and without further ado, let me hand over to Markus for his lecture. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, James. It's a pleasure to be with you and it's an honor to give the Green Swan lecture for this conference. I think it's a great conference to have and to have this opportunity to present my thoughts here. And I'm hoping for feedback from the audience during my presentation. So I should say first that what I say is based on joint work with Jean-Pierre Landau, which we have written down earlier. But new thoughts came to me in the last few days, and that's why it's also reflected in this presentation. So if you ask me what's a big climate question, in my view, is that how do we manage the green transition? And the managing the green transitions, there are two ways to think about it. One is to reduce economic activity, to cut back on CO2 emissions. And the second way is to develop some competitive renewable or sequestration technology and really make sure that we can exploit the economies of scale of these technologies and scale them up across the globe. And if it just gives you some idea, so if you reduce economic activity, the first strategy, the first green transition, we tried to do this to some extent in the COVID lockdown in 2020, and the CO2 emissions by some measures went down by 5.8%. So it's probably way too small. So just reducing economic activity will not do the trick. So we really need new technology to have some way to dealing with that. And for this to really unleash this new technology, we need some coordinated effort because we might be stuck in some QWERTY problems. So as you probably know, QWERTY refers to how the keyboard is assigned, the buttons on the keyboards are assigned. And we have it assigned this way because in the old tradition, we got stuck in this way. We might be in a local equilibrium there. So we need some push out, some coordinated push to get around that. Now, let me illustrate why I think the second approach is the only way to do that and what the complications are with this approach. I will illustrate this with the example of Germany. So let's suppose Germany would cut back on its CO2 emission, would cut back on its economic activity and totally eliminate the CO2 emissions. It would be about 2% of the global CO2 emissions. So if the advanced economy like Germany, it's a large economy, would cut back, it would really not make a big dent to the total CO2 emissions. Now, if on the other hand, a country like Germany were to develop new technologies and ways to scale up the technologies and then share it with the rest of the world, and make these new technologies, the clean technologies, cheaper than the traditional energy sources, then it would have a huge implication to the whole global economy. So you see already clearly that the first approach is not going to do much. The second approach might have a huge impact. Now, and Germany did this, and they did it in the middle of 2000 with solar power. And as you probably remember, Germany was a country which really promoted solar power in the early 2000s. And the idea was at that time, you really want to exploit the economies of scale. In order to get solar power to make it cheaper, you have to really scale it up dramatically. So Germany subsidized solar power tremendously, and a whole solar power industry evolved. in Germany. But then in the mid of 2000, it collapsed and the whole industry moved to China because then the production were much lower. So you saw a huge technology transfer from Germany to China in a sense, but if you, from a global perspective, you might say that's actually now the solar panels are even cheaper because you could produce them even more cheaply in China. And then they can spread much more quickly across the globe. And that makes a huge difference. But you can see already the tension there. The tension then is essentially, why would Germany invest so much and subsidize the development of solar power if subsequently it moves on to another industry? But the big question is, what policies do we have and should we have to incentivize the second approach? This first approach, I think we would be doomed to do that. Now, the big challenge here is that there's a timing consistency problem. When you want to convince a company to invest in order to invest in new technology and also how to scale it up. So it's not, we might have the technology already, but we don't know how to scale it up and bring the marginal costs down. You want to promise the company some intellectual property rights, saying, okay, you get some intellectual property rights if you invest a lot and scale up the production, new technologies and all this, you get intellectual property rights. But once we have this technology, then later on, we as a global citizens would like to then tell the rest of the world, please adopt it too, because you will save the climate. And that's where the time consistency comes in. Initially, we would say, would like give you some intellectual property rights, some patent rights, or whatever it is, in order to invest a lot and find out ways to scale up this new clean technology. But later, would like to spread it across the globe and get rid of intellectual property rights. It's a little bit like the COVID vaccine. You would say, give a lot of money there, and then later on, you would like to easily distribute the technology in order to save the world. And that's a huge timing consistency problem we have to deal with. Now, the other dangers are, so that's one big problem. The other big challenge and the other danger is that we really have some new green policies which really lead to a decline in non-green technologies. Okay, that's one extent. And on the other hand, it does not really boost the green technology investments. So it will be sluggish or nothing. And if you put this both together, because now investing in non-green technology is much more risky and you don't have really some scalable green technologies coming in the investments, then what you actually do is you de facto create a cartel with limited supply of energy and high profits for the existing non-green technologies. So essentially you're subsidizing non-green technologies by doing so. Because nobody wants to invest, expand capacity, you just limit supply and the price will go up, energy prices will go up, and then you have a cartel created, an artificial cartel created for the existing energy suppliers. It's a little bit like, Russia supplying less oil now, but their revenue is still the same because they just sell the existing smaller amount of oil at a much higher price, so they get the same amount of revenue at the end of the day. And if that's the case, energy prices will be high. Of course, we will reduce consumption, other consumption, and that's actually then pointing to transition number one, which I said is actually will fail us. It's not the energy, the green transition number two, where we really have to go for new technology to solve that. And these are the big challenges. And the question is, what policies will we implement in order to get to this number two transition, if you believe my thing, rather than the number one transition? We don't want to go for a strategy which will not ultimately save the global planet. So that's a big challenge. I'm starting out with the big question, the big challenges, and I would like to go through how do we approach this and how do the existing policies we're having now, how do help us or hurt us to achieve this objective? And so I implemented, and I mentioned already the two green transitions, how we might lead to an implicit energy cartel and this timing consistency. And I would like to go through various climate policy instruments right now. Now, one direct instrument is essentially saying, really, we have to subsidize R&D investments, in particular investments which help us to scale up things, to develop, producing steel with hydrogen and so forth, and how to scale it up, learn how to do this, and also learning by doing this. Because R&D essentially, for environmental reasons, has a double externality. First, R&D investments has positive spillovers to others competing firms. That's an externality, a positive externality. There's an investment in that. And then there's the environmental benefit on top of it, which is also an externality. And Bill Nordhaus calls this the double externality. For R&D purposes, there's an externality, and for environmental purposes, there's another externality. So we should really subsidize R&D investments in that space. And one way to do subsidize is to take out the risk, to de-risk the green investment, to make sure that we have these investments at scale. And Michael Kremer has proposed for other purposes, for vaccines and other aspects, the advanced purchase agreements of these new technologies, where the government says, okay, I guarantee to buy some certain amount of technology from you at a fixed price, so we take out the risk of that. So the advanced purchase agreement is one way to get these R&D subsidies going. So if you look at the global aspect, so the US is more following this R&D investment subsidy strategy. Now, another policy is, of course, to have CO2 taxes and permits. I will come to that. And a third policy is to have directed credits, like what we did in the 1970s. And often the way we try to implement that now, the central bank community, through financial risk, matching it with financial risk and so forth, or through monetary policy. And finally, there's this whole ESG aspects, which outsource the investments to the private sector. Which one is green, which one is not green? That's all decided by the private sector rather than the public sector, the governments. Now let me illustrate these instruments, going a little bit more in details what the different policies instruments are. So first of all, we can actually focus on the pollution or the resources or the source of the pollution, or we can focus on the risk interacted with pollutions. Okay, so just to give you an idea, the question is, let's suppose we have a firm or many firms and we have a production function where the output Y is equal to a TFP, total factor productivity, times the production function. And the inputs are labor, capital, and pollution. And ideally, we would like just to tax pollution, or we just put some charge on pollution, whether it's a pollution tax, like a Pigouvian pollution tax, or some pollution permits. It doesn't really matter, but it's very targeted to the pollution. And this way, we would actually target what's going on. But what we really do in most of the regulations is we actually taxing risky capital. So that's the second input. So it's not the pollution input, it's actually a risky capital input. And this only works if pollution and capital is tightly connected. So if, for example, you might have a low risk polluting firm, so if the company is not very risky but it's highly polluting, we tax the wrong thing. So you actually don't hit the margin you really want to hit. You really want to hit the pollution and not the risk associated with that, because the risk, whether risk and pollution is co-moving with each other, that's not obvious at all. So you can create some artificial risk in order to get pollution risk and make the capital more risky. But in general, you want to tax the pollution rather than the riskiness of capital. And of course, you also get distortion with labor and capital if capital is considered more risky, but labor is not. So there will also be a distortion on that margin. So there's a lot of tricky aspects to consider. So the way we do that by, focusing on pollution versus focusing on risk interacted with pollution is in a strange way. And that's, a caricature way to illustrate that. So first, let me do the direct way. That's essentially the way to go, but it might be politically more thorny and more difficult to implement. And because we cannot implement, we implement it in a roundabout way and a much less efficient way. And then let me highlight these differences. The first thing is, let's have a pollution tax. A pollution tax, we know we have a pre-specified carbon price. So the price of carbon is not very volatile. It gives us some guarantee what the price of volatile is. But the quantity of pollution will be volatile. That's one way to go. Another way is to have pollution permits. With pollution permits, it will be the case that you have a pre-specified pollution level, or the carbon quantity is fixed, but then the price can move around, and then there's a risk premium on the price because the price is volatile. So there's a trade-off. Do you want to have certainty on the price, or do you want to have certainty on the quantity polluted? So if you want certainty on the price, you want taxes. If you want certainty on the a quantity of pollution or even zero, then you need a pollution permit scheme, cap and trade scheme. And of course, you can also be somewhere in the middle where you do a cap and trade scheme, but the total supply of permits, you just modify as the price moves around. If the price goes really through the roof, you give more pollution permits. If the price goes down, you remove some pollution permits. And that's essentially, you manage essentially the aggregate supply in order to limit the total volatility of the carbon price volatility. So these are the direct ways, and that's what ideally we should do. But what we do is we do something different. We actually do, through financial regulation, we actually focus on risk interaction interacted with pollution. So that's what I call risk X pollution here. And what we do is we create uncertainty or risk for non-green technology. So let's create some additional risk exogenously, make this polluting industries more risky for some political reasons. We create some extra risk. And then there will be an extra risk premium on non-green investments, because now it's risky. We have created some risk, and then we have higher funding costs for non-green investment, and that reduces the non-green investment, hopefully in favor of the green investment. Of course, this leads to higher energy prices, but there's one big difference between a pollution tax or a permit versus this way working through uncertainty and the finance way of working with risk and uncertainty interacted with pollution. The big difference is if you impose a Pigouvian tax on pollution, you get some tax revenue. If you sell your permits, you get some revenue from selling the permits. If you do it via the risk, you get no tax revenue. Essentially, you create some risk for polluting firms, and then you charge a higher risk premium on them. And who gets this higher risk premium? This will be the investors. The investors will get them a risk premium for investing in non-green assets, in assets which are polluting more. This will be more risky. They get a higher risk premium. And of course, you still have the fact that you will actually steer investment away from non-green towards green investments. But the Pigouvian tax revenue you would get otherwise, you give to investors. And investors get it because they have to bear some extra risk. They get some disutility from having this extra risk. So it's a total welfare loss. So you just forgo essentially the tax revenue. And that's the way we are on. That's the way we are doing things. We don't, of course, we also do a CO2 tax and permits and all this cap and trade scheme. But the emphasis is very much on the finance component, which is a very, you forgo essentially a huge amount of tax revenue. And it's total social welfare loss. Now, if you want to really focus on the risk, there's a problem with the risk itself, because the climate risk is somehow different from the financial risk associated with it. So there's a strategy of horizons, or here I call it risk horizons. If you think about climate change risk, it works over decades. It's a cumulative process. And in the early phase, risks are showing up, in flooding and other things. These are severe risks, and one has to think about them, but they're mostly idiosyncratic risks. So they're locally focused on local aspects, and then they're idiosyncratic risks. And then the question is, are they uninsurable or not insurable? But they're, at least in the initial phase, idiosyncratic. But they can be systematic if they are persistent shocks. So it could be some risk materializes and then actually has a long-lasting impact. And that's essentially when you think about tipping points. Now that's what I have on this figure here. You have a figure where there's a shock. Normally it would bounce back and you go back. There's a resilient process. But if you have a tipping point, you hit the tipping point and then you get into feedback spirals and things will get much worse. So what are these examples? Let's suppose the Gulf Stream dries up and the Gulf Stream is not warming Europe anymore. So now Europe becomes much colder compared to before. Then we cannot switch on the Gulf Stream anymore. That's a tipping point. So that's why it's not only long run. So it seems like it's only the long run risk. There's also a short run risk realization. Then it's a persistent shock because you hit a tipping point. And so in this sense, climate risk can be short term, but then we have to focus on this type of risk we're facing. So, but in general, the climate risk is a cumulative process. It will hit first more locally, and then it will, over decades, become more and more severe And the question is how to ramp up the system. Financial risk, on the other hand, is more 8 to 10 years or 7 years. It's typically, there's a financial cycle, there's a buildup of risk and it erupts during crisis. And of course, this is a volatility paradox. It might be that some system looks very solid, like an oak, very, very solid, doesn't move much. But when there is a hurricane coming, it falls over and can't stand up anymore. While another system looks very volatile, but actually, like the reed here in this picture, it bounces back all the time. And it ultimately, the system which looks more volatile might be actually the more resilient system and ultimately the more stable system, and not the one which looks very solid and very rigid in a sense. But in general, it is the case the climate change risk is very long run. The financial risk is much more short run. So one, we're talking about decades. The other one, we talk about years. And that's a tension that the strategy of rises with Mark Carney pointed out earlier in one of his speeches. But this tension here is not dramatic if you focus on the persistent shocks, like the tipping point aspects to that. Now, how do we create this risk? So as I mentioned, the climate events, they're more long run, except if they're persistent, they're more idiosyncratic in this. So that's a challenge to figure out. In order to generate risk, in order to have this risk premium on non-green investments, you can create your own risks through policies. Okay, so you can make the existing policies or future policies more risky, and then you get more the stranded assets. Okay, then you can get stranded assets, and I go, I don't know whether there will be a CO2 tax or not, a capital border adjustment or not. There will be a lot of these things floating around. We're debating all of the things, and that creates a lot of perceived risk and actually risk policy risk. And that's the biggest hit on some non-green assets. And this risk essentially is then creating some extra risk premium and makes non-green investments more expensive relative to green investments. And for this, we can incorporate this in stress tests, internal capital adequacy assessment processes, and all this. And you're all better experts in how to incorporate this in our various frameworks to reflect this risk. But it's the policy risk which then cranks up the risk, and in order to really distort an investment towards green financing. Now, so essentially, there are different ways to implement it. One is bank regulation. We can put some different risk weights on it. And the challenge, of course, with traditional risk weights is also, it might be that the green investments themselves might be intrinsically riskier, okay? Because we don't know, it's a new way to do and try things out. We don't know how this new technology will work out, so intrinsically it might be risky. So this new technology might be riskier than that. So we have to work very hard to create some extra risk on the existing technologies in order to outweigh that. Or the alternative is, and I mentioned this earlier, to make these green investments less risky or de-risk it by the government stepping in to take out the risk of new technologies, providing certain advanced purchase agreements and other things. But we're going back very much in 1970s in the directed credit. And of course, once we have directed credit, we are subject to a lot of lobby, crony capitalism and all this, because every industry will think, oh, this is the way to go forward. And that needs some really serious governance structure to handle that. And then, as it came up in the earlier panel discussion, the taxonomy is very important. It's highly politically controversial. Is a nuclear power, is it green or is it not green? Is gas green or not green? There are huge debates in Europe of what's green and what's not green. And then there's the whole thing, if you can't make a decision by the governments, typically we go to the private sector and outsource it to the private sector. So who decides whether something is green or not is then outsourced to the private sector, to some rating agencies. S&P is deciding whether Tesla is green or not green. It's removed from democracy. It's removed to some private entities to decide, make the decisions for us. Is this the right thing? And that's a big question we have to decide for ourselves. Who should be deciding which industries to favor, which technologies to favor, and which ones not to favor? What governance structure? I think that's one of the big issues. What's the governance structure we should have? And we have these ESG ratings. There's a lot of greenwashing, of course, going on. There are many papers showing the low correlation between the CO2 emissions and the ESG ratings. And one is, low correlation between among the ESG ratings themselves. So if they all were to rate the same thing, there should be some correlation among the ESG ratings, and that's very low. That's one paper here. Another one looks, it's an IMF working paper, which looks at the correlation between the actual CO2 emissions and the ESG ratings. There's very low correlation as well. So it's very clear that's not the ideal framework. So there are two answers for that. One is, of course, to say we're in the early phase and it's a learning process and doesn't work so well, and it will work much better down the road. Another thing is there's too much political emphasis on this, and there's a lot of money to be made, and that's why it doesn't work so well.
Markus, it's James here. I have a question from the floor, if it's okay just to interrupt you at this point.
Yes.
So the question from the floor is that you've talked about the creation of policy risk. But the question is, isn't it the case that the main driver of that risk is the uncertainty about the implementation of climate policy rather than financial regulation or practices? So that's the question from the floor. What is the source of uncertainty? Thank you.
Yes, so that's a very good point. So I agree with the question that the main driver is essentially the uncertainty of the implementation. It's not necessarily the financial regulation which creates the uncertainty. It's more at what speed do we implement, for example, CO2 taxes or other measures? Do we outline a clear path going forward? Or, that's what we do in the next 15, 20 years, or do we just leave it open and then make decisions as we come along? And if you go for the latter, there's a lot of uncertainty coming from that. If you go for the former, where you outline a green path, a clear, clean green path, then actually there would be much less uncertainty from that. And that's very much so. It's not really the implementation of the bank regulation, or that's another layer of uncertainty, but I don't think that's the main driver. The main driver comes really from the big green policies. Very good. So let me just say where you might want to have some policy risk in this, because it might enable certain policy measures. So this is a little bit more speculative, but the idea is the following. Let's suppose you want to implement certain green policies, but you don't want to shock the industry immediately by having a new green policy down the road. So what you do, essentially, you first talk about it and make the industry worried about it. And then many firms will have some climate risk provisions. And as they put climate risk provisions on their balance sheets and have some extra buffers built up, then the political resistance and the lobbying effort to really ultimately implement, let's say, the high CO2 taxes will go down. And then you don't have so many stranded assets because you have already put some provisions into the balance sheet, and then it will be easier to push through the policy down the road. So there are two ways you can think of. One is we don't do anything at the moment, but then in 1 or 2 years we introduce the CO2, and there will be huge CO2 taxes, and there will be huge political resistance and lobbying effort because firms are not prepared for that. And then there will be, because of this unpreparedness, there will be this huge number of stranded assets, and that's essentially a big problem. The alternative is to say, I have this policy risk, I don't know what happens, and firms prepare for that, and the bank regulation helps the banks to prepare for that, and that reduces the political resistance to actually ultimately do these policy measures. And when the policy measures come, because firms have prepared for that, there will be fewer stranded assets, and that makes that's easier to implement. Now, another way to implement policies is by greening existing policies. So we have a lot of existing policies already, and the question is, can we just green some of these policies? And it's, do we want specialized green policies or multi-purpose policies? And we can go along all the policies we have and we just make them green. To some extent, we can be green monetary policy. The monetary policy is about price stability and financial stability. Can we make it green as well? And then you have to question, how do we evaluate the greening of existing policies? So is it the most effective way to address the climate change? And I touched upon that already. Or does it interfere with original policy areas? Okay, so with the original objectives? And based on these two criteria, we have to effectiveness and interference with other policy objectives, we have to then decide whether it makes sense, rather than having new instruments which are targeted to uh, particular climate aspects, do we have the greening of existing policies? And of course, one problem with greening existing policies, it diminishes its accountability. If you have one clear objective for an agency like the central bank, it gets clear accountability, and it also weakens then, of course, if you have many not clear accountability, it weakens independence because you go in other policy areas. And I will come back to the independence argument later on. So I touched upon that, but let me just mention it. The big question, I will come back to this in monetary policy arena as well, how to ramp up the policy measures. And on one hand, you would like to lay out a clear path ex ante that reduces risk premia, and that makes actually the whole thing much cheaper to do from a society perspective. Now, the alternative is to keep it flexible. So what's a clear path has a cost to it, because if you learn, as we go through time, we'll learn how severe the climate change is, and we learn new technologies which might be better to implement. Once we have laid out a clear path, we cannot easily adjust. So on the other extreme is to keep flexibility, and that makes you more resilient because you can adjust as you learn, you adapt and react and re-optimize. But you can see there's another time consistency problem there. On the one hand, you want to minimize risk premia and really have exactly clear path. On the other hand, you want to keep the flexibility to modify as you learn more. Let's say the climate change becomes more severe, you want to crank up the policies even further. And that's essentially the big challenge one faces. Now let me move to monetary policy for my remaining time and in climate change. And there's the strategy of horizons. Marconi mentioned is, of course, there's on the one hand, you have climate change for decades and monetary policy 2-3 years, depending what's your underlying mind frame. But if you're New Keynesian, it's all about price stickiness. You think, how long will this price stickiness make monetary policy work? If you're in a macro financial friction world, I'm working a lot, and then there are more long-run effects also of monetary policy. But most importantly, what I want to talk today is about the impact of R star. So if we do a green transition, what is the impact on R star? And what's R star? It's a useful guide whether monetary policy is contractionary or expansionary. So interest rate, the real interest rate is above R star, then it's contractionary. If it's below R star, it's expansionary. And we also would like to know, how far away from the effective lower bound or the reversal interest rate. If R star is very low, then we are very close to the effective lower bound all the time. If R star is very high, and hence we might be hitting the effective lower bound more frequently. That's not of an issue right now, but 1 year ago it was everybody was worried about that. And R star is very much driven by structural forces. So it's very the investment and all that feeds into that. Here's my favorite equation, one of my favorite equations. So the risk-free rate, the R star, is given by the following equation. It's like rho, which is a time preference rate of the repressive agent in the economy, or the average time preference rate of the agents in the economy. So that's how much the value future utility compared to existing utility. That's rho. Plus gamma. Gamma is the risk aversion coefficient, or also 1 over the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So how much you want to smooth consumption over time. That's 1 over gamma. And mu c is the growth rate of the consumption stream, minus a gamma half times gamma plus 1, the volatility of the consumption stream. That gives you the R star. And I think each term is very illuminating what the green transition will do. So first of all, we have the rho, that's the time preference rate. The second term is the so-called Ramsey term. That's, Ramsey derived this term. And that's also about the intergenerational fairness of things. So if, for example, consumption stream grows very fast, then future generations will be very wealthy. But let me focus here on the R star component. So if the current consumption, so if we really do a huge initial investment right now, we have to cut back consumption. And then later on, because we did this huge investment, consumption will grow. So the consumption growth rate will be higher. So current consumption will be depressed. And we will, because of this depressed consumption today, consumption growth rate going forward will be higher. So that's essentially meaning that the growth rate of consumption is going up. This mu C is going up. That means our star is going up. But how much our star is going up depends very much how we ramp up the green transition. So how do we introduce the green transition? And I have depicted here two figures. One over time was the red one versus the green one. Perhaps should have flipped the colors. The green one starts slowly and ramps up then. Then the R star would initially not be so much higher, but then it goes up a lot. But if we go very aggressively into the phase where we, the existing capital stock we throw away and have to replace it with a new capital stock, a green capital stock very quickly, it will be the case we have to cut back on consumption today. And then when the new capital stock keeps working, then the consumption growth is going up. So we have this red line. So we have a lot of the slope essentially of the red one is very high initially, and it means the R star is going up significantly. It also means in order to control inflation, we have to crank up the interest rates more dramatically. So this is the second term, which is really about investment. There will be a lot of investment demand. If we want to implement this transition, a lot of extra investments have to be financed. That moves up the real interest rate. R star is going up. And it would be nice to quantify that. I have not seen any quantification and a way to nicely quantify that, how big this is. Is this 100, 200 basis points? And how does it depend on the introduction of the green transition? The second thing I wanted to say is the third term. If there's a lot of uncertainty, that depresses R star. That's because of precautionary savings. If there's more risk, the sigma C is the volatility of the consumption stream. If there's more risk and if gamma goes higher, so the risk aversion is higher, then it depresses the R star. And that depends also how we introduce that, but the risk can come in two forms. The risk can come because of some policy risk. It can also become of some climate risk. If there's a lot of climate risk, in particular in later phase, it will depress the R star, and also policy risk will depress R star. And we have to, put both of these in models, and have to then get a good sense how the green transition and the way we introduce the green transition is impacting R star. So then that's probably one of the most important aspects. Now, of course, if there's more frequency extreme weather events, and if there are aggregate shocks, not only locally idiosyncratic shocks, then we would hit the effective lower bound more frequently. So that's one thing to consider. And then you might say, we need a high inflation target, particularly if R star stays low. Might also see it as a negative supply shocks, and you don't want to stimulate a negative supply shock with demand. That essentially leads to more inflation. We are just experiencing this at the moment. And it might be more, so if it's mostly a regional, local shock, this problem might be much more, the increased shocks might be more severe for small and medium-sized economies. If you have huge economy and one region is hit, you can actually, through fiscal measures, can do some risk sharing. If you're a very small country, you can't do this risk sharing so well. So this might be more severe for smaller countries, so they have to take this into account more frequently, that they will have more volatility to bear on this. And there might be, generally, there will be more volatility in inflation because of these risks. And this might more easily de-anchor than the inflation expectations. Now, in terms of monetary policy instruments, there are many ways to do more fine-tuning on the green side. So this was what I did before. The first two slides of monetary policy is a big scheme of monetary policy. How is climate change affecting monetary policy? But generally now, how can we tilt investments towards the green transition? And we can do this, of course, by giving favorable haircuts to green technologies. We can do the asset purchase towards green securities. All of this is like credit policy measures where we favor one type of industry over another type of industry. And this will, of course, lead to some readjustment of balance sheets. And that leads, stepping back, what is the function of policies? More generally, what are the three major functions? And one is, of course, the allocation of resources, so who gets what. and how do we produce the production capacities, and also allocation of risk. So as we allocate risk, we actually, the total amount of risk in the economy will also change because the amount of endogenous risk is moving. Systemic risk and endogenous risk is moving. So if we concentrate risk into one sector, then there's more risk coming out in total for the whole economy rather than if you spread it nicely across all the sectors. So that's one thing. One is the allocation of risk, the other one and other resources. The second aspect, a la Musgrave, is redistribution, and the third one is stability, like price and financial stability. And the third one is in the realm of central banks. So the first one, the allocation of resources, that's industrial policy, redistribution, from rich to poor and so forth. This needs essentially support from the voters and support from the parliament, and should not be outsourced to some agency because is very highly political in a sense. And then there's a question, to what extent should the central banks be involved in that? And that depends on the spillovers central bank policy creates. And one is the principle of market neutrality, that you don't want to intervene with market neutrality. But if you say, if there's a market failure, it might be useful to intervene in a way to correct this market failure. And that's an economic argument. The political argument is that, politicians can't make it. Then essentially central bank have to do it, or put it differently, they have to contribute to the overall political agenda. They should not lean against or stay neutral against the political agenda set by the parliament or the governments. And that leads me to the central bank independence, and how should we think about central bank independence in the light of green monetary policy. So if you have no independent central bank, that's a non-issue. So if your central bank is part of the finance ministry or you're part of an autocracy, then it's not an issue. But typically, resource allocation and redistribution is assigned to elected bodies rather than to agencies, which are one step further removed from the electorate. And what's really important for these special bodies, the agencies like central banks, to have a well-specified mandate, to live within this well-specified mandate. And, for the US, you have this dual, actually a triple mandate. So you have, on the one hand, you have price stability, but then you also have economic growth. Unemployment should be sufficiently low, but also long-term interest rates should be stable. It's in the law, but it's often not mentioned. And for the European Central Bank, you have this lexicographic hierarchical structure that you say price stability comes first. And if it doesn't affect price stability, other overall European Union objectives can also enter in the mandate. But the secondary objectives. But then the question comes, can the central bank freely select their preferred secondary objectives? So which one should be the secondary objective? Or should the elected body select the secondary objective? Should the European Parliament, for example, decide this is your secondary objective once your lexicographically price stability is not touched upon? But then the parliament or in national parliaments can decide about the Pigouvian taxes themselves. Why would they outsource it, the secondary objective, to the ECB? In general, whenever you go this round, the central bank is dragged deeper in the political realm and might make it harder to satisfy its primary objective, which is price stability. Finally, let me say a few things some people argue that we should have to change the measurement of inflation because of the green transition. I will see the argument coming. There will be inflation coming from the green transition. There's extra costs coming, extra investments. We're destroying certain capital stock. There will be positive price pressures coming. And should we correct our inflation measures for that? And it might be the case that we need larger relative price changes because things are changing so dramatically. And higher overall inflation targets might be helpful to create these relative price changes. That's in particular the case if there's price rigidity for large price cuts in certain products. But the evidence actually is not helpful on this, or is not conducive to that, because you see a lot of, like, if you think about TVs or electronics, they experience a steady decline in nominal prices over the last decade, and it's not really the case that we can handle these price declines. It's a little bit like moving the goal post or the target when you exclude green transition price changes, and it might be leading to a loss of credibility overall if you just change people they feel everything is getting more expensive, but you exclude the products which are getting more expensive from your inflation measure. So let me conclude. I think, coming back to my initial big question, it's, I think, the moral duty of advanced economies to develop and subsidize scalable technologies, and that's way more effective. And I highlighted the German example. If Germany goes to climate CO2 neutral or doesn't emit any CO2s anymore, it just reduces global CO2 by 2%, which will not make any difference. If Germany develops scalable technologies and then export these technologies, and other countries find it more cheaper to produce with new technologies, green technologies, it would make a huge impact. So it's way more effective. So we need policies to really have the second thing. But it comes with a time consistency problem, because you promise companies some intellectual property rights in order to invest now, to take on this risk. But later you want to say to the rest of the world, please copy it because it will save the climate, and the initial investment then will be not a wise one for the initial companies. So that's very much, as I mentioned, the vaccines for COVID. Similar time and consistency problem. Then there's the sluggish green R&D investments, which might happen, and a decline in overall investments, energy investments as all. It's like an implicit cartel for the energy sector, and there will be high energy price, high profits for the industry, and it's like a Pigouvian revenue for the industry rather than for the tax for the governments. So you shift essentially benefit to the energy industry, and they're benefiting already now enormously. Now, the policy measures we focus on, they can focus directly on pollution, or it can focusing on the risk associated with pollution, but it's not clear that pollution and risk goes hand in hand in core moves, but you can make policies to make high polluting firms more risky. And that's the case by making the policies somehow risky, the climate policy risky, then you get more easily a co-movement in it too. And this will actually then create some risk premium for non-green in technologies or firms. And the risk premium, who gets this risk premium? This will be the investors who invest in these non-green technologies or these old technologies. And there's a Pigouvian tax revenue going to the investors, but not to the governments again. So you actually subsidize investors, but it's not really a subsidy, because investors also have to bear this risk and they get some disutility out of it. They're just compensated for this disutility. The whole ESG, where we outsource the decision making to the private sector rather than doing by the government, its question, is this a democratic way? Who decides what's green or not? Should it be some rating agencies, or should it be some government authorities? And it is subject to greenwashing, as I mentioned before, and you're very well aware of this. And there's the greening of other policies. There's multi-purpose. So you take existing policies and make them green. And you have to be very careful, because you might undermine the initial objective of the policies. It might be not an efficient way, an effective way of doing things. And then I zoomed in on monetary policy, on green monetary policy. There is actually a huge impact on our star, and this depends very much how big the impact on our star is, depends on how we transition in, how do we ramp it up. And that, of course, will have implications on monetary policy. It probably has to tighten monetary policy significantly if there's all this new investment demand coming in, and we have to, consumption growth is actually, the consumption is depressed, and hopefully we grow out of it subsequently. And it can also threaten the central bank independence if you go beyond the first principle of your mandate, which is price stability. So let me stop here and open up for questions. Sorry for running probably over time.
Markus, thanks very much for a really interesting and thought-provoking lecture that I think gives those of us working in central banks some considerable food for thought. I might just ask you a couple of questions if that's okay. So, I mean, you talked a lot in your presentation about the balance between who should take action between central banks and governments. And I guess from a central bank perspective, I'm used to thinking of two potential motivations for central banks to think about climate issues. So, one is the issue that came up in the previous part of this panel discussion, which is that, as you said, in terms of our purchases in markets, we tend to go for a market neutrality approach. But I guess what we've started to think in recent years is that perhaps, given the information we've got on firms' transition plans and given the disclosure, that market neutrality approach may not actually be market neutral because the market isn't properly pricing some of these risks. And so we've tended to think of, considering greening some of our operations as being a way to adjust for that distortion. I think the second reason that we've thought about climate impacts for monetary policy um, is because of the potential for climate shocks to become repeated and also to become persistent, and also to have short run effects as well as the longer run effects that you mentioned in terms of our stars. So I think perhaps in your taxonomy, this was the sort of shocks component. But if those shocks are repeated, if they're more persistent, then perhaps there's a role for monetary policy, because if it affects the macroeconomy, then monetary policy needs to adjust. So I'd sort of be interested in your reflections on those two potential points in terms of central banks' role. And just to ask one final question, if I may, from a government perspective, I think one challenge perhaps in implementing a tax could be implementing it globally and implementing it in a consistent way if we were to tax carbon. Now, of course, you could do something locally and you could have carbon border adjustment mechanisms to make up for that. But I guess my question to you is, if we weren't able to agree on a global tax on carbon, what would be your suggested approach forwards? Would it be that individual countries try to do their own thing and use carbon border adjustment mechanisms, or would it be to fall back to some of these second best options? So yeah, those are my sort of two questions. Thank you.
Yeah, actually, there are three. Let me answer them all. So the first one was what to do if the market is not pricing risk correctly, and I mean, as central bank, have better information. And that reminds, it's a tricky thing. On the one hand, how can you presume that you know it better than the market? But I have done a lot of behavioral economics, and I know that the market is not always right. And this way, it makes sense if you have superior information and better information collection, that on the one hand, you adjust your portfolio, but on the other hand, through communication, make clear what your method is and also affect the market by doing so. And it reminds me a little bit when there's a bubble more generally, and the central bank community might also the whole market becomes very frothy and situation getting out of hand, that you might want to lean against these bubbles. And that's a little bit here. Instead of leaning against mispricings because of bubbles, you lean against mispricing because the financial sector is not fully incorporating these green risks or non-green risks. And I think that makes sense, but one has to probably supplement it with a great communication policy in order to help the market to, or share the information, essentially, the superior information you have to share it with the market. Now, with regard to the climate shocks, I agree with you that if initially the shocks, if there will be some local hurricane, hitting a part of the country, that seems initially a more idiosyncratic because it doesn't hit the whole economy and not wipe out the whole economy, except if you're a small, very, very small country. So it's more idiosyncratic. It can be shared. If there's a good fiscal framework in place, then it has less implications for monetary policy, less implications for our star. But on the other hand, if there are persistent shocks, and as I mentioned, the Gulf Stream stopping, things like that, if there are tipping points and the permafrost, going away, these shocks, there have to be first order appropriate in this. So, and that's essentially going there. So overall, in my big picture question was, very much promoting, new technologies, and equally importantly, making it cheap, the new technologies, through scalability, like the solar power. was extremely expensive in the mid-2000s. It was not economically viable. But once you subsidize it and lift it across a certain quantity, then it becomes suddenly a cheaper way to produce than traditional energies. And we have to find ways to do this in many ways with other new renewable technologies. So how should we go this about in a global context? That's, of course, challenging. My view is that one way is, of course, to say certain countries have to move ahead, and their technologically advanced countries have to move ahead, and the regulation has to move ahead. And in a sense, Germany is still paying through higher electricity prices, the transition in the mid-2000s for scaling up the solar power. They're still paying for this, but I think it was overall a good thing for the globe. And to some extent, you get some technological advancement. So the story is always move ahead, become the industry leader. You get some economic advantages, and then it will pay off this way, even if you don't have a border adjustment tax. It is just some technological advantages. On the other hand, that tension is that you would like that the rest of the world is totally adopting it as well. So you want to give up your technological advantages and just give it away to the rest of the world so we can save the planet. And for this, we have to find some agreement that essentially you get perhaps some, edge for a certain time. It's like a patent almost. You get some patent for a few years, you get some advancement and advantage for some reward for investing and figuring out how to scale up these new technologies. But the award is dying out quickly, and then it passes on to the rest of the world. And how to schedule that and how to phase this in, I don't see any debate along this dimension. And I think this is my view, this is the most important debate. It's all about, how to do certain things, but that's, I think I would steer the debate to. I'm not sure whether central banks can do that. That's probably for the governments to figure out. And then, of course, there's the club idea that Bill Nordhaus proposes, that you form clubs and you can be part of the club and then move ahead. And that could be, the OECD or some club moving ahead and doing things. I don't see how the central banks can contribute to that, but I have to think more carefully about that.
Yeah, thanks very much, Markus. I think when it comes to those last issues, I think it is much more for governments than central banks, as you say. But we're out of time now, and so I think we should probably close this session. So let me just finish by saying thank you very much to Markus for his interesting and thought-provoking lecture. I think we really are at the early stage of understanding the impact of both climate change and also the transition that we will need to make on the economy. And I think that one of the things we're going to try and do in the NGFS over the next few years is to understand this a little bit better. So and I think as part of that, it will be really important for us to talk to you, Markus, and your colleagues in academia to learn from your work and ideas in that thinking. So let me stop there. And at this point, I'm going to pass back to Jean. Jean, over to you.
Many thanks, James, and indeed thanks, Markus, for the lecture. We are indeed running almost 20 minutes out of time, so we'll cut the break short. No, it was very interesting, Markus, so I don't regret any of that, of these minutes. But we'll cut the break short and reconvene at 3 if you're sitting in Paris, 2 if you're in London. I don't know which hour it will be if you're in on the other side of the Atlantic, for a special address by Al Gore, and that's all I have to add. So enjoy the break and let's reconvene in 10 minutes.